Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. As Russian forces advance on Pokrovsk, one of Ukraine's last strongholds in Donetsk, Kiev has been launching deeper strikes inside Russia. Meanwhile, reports of unexplained drone activity over European airspace have raised new security questions across the continent. We're joined now by David Kirichenko, Associate Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, to discuss what these developments mean for Ukraine and Europe. Thanks so much for joining us here on TVP World. I want to start with the latest on the battlefield. I mean, if we're looking at Pokrovsk, I mean, this has been getting so much attention these last few days, really. This is something that really matters. Tell us your assessment in terms of why this city matters so much, and if it falls, what that could mean for Ukraine.
Certainly. This, for Ukraine, Pokrovsk is one of the last remaining major hubs in Donetsk Oblast, and the Russians are certainly hoping to capture Pokrovsk and to open up a new offensive to capture two of the larger remaining cities in Donetsk Oblast, which is Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. And gaining Pokrovsk, it's on a more hilltop, so if the Russians do take Pokrovsk, it's going to be easier to launch some of their offensive and drone operations against the remaining Ukrainian defensive lines. But also Pokrovsk is, I think, that in the top 60 or 70 cities in terms of size in Ukraine. So it's not that big of a town or city, but it is in terms of it being one of the last remaining bigger cities that Russia needs to capture. And for the Russians, it's really important to show progress on the battlefield. I mean, they're taking almost 1,000 casualties a day trying to wage this offensive to take Pokrovsk, and the Russians have deployed many, if not the majority of their elite units to the sector, and as well as the Ukrainians have. So it's a really tough battle. Ukraine has deployed some of its elite defense intelligence forces there, and some of the top brigades are fighting in the area. And so both sides are throwing as much as they have for the fight for Pokrovsk, and the Russians need to show something. I mean, for their massive losses, and I think Putin is hoping to show that they can still make battlefield progress, and hope that by showing some sort of Russian victory on the battlefield, that the Europeans will just say, all right, there's nothing that we can do. We just should pack it up, allow Ukraine to fall. So Ukraine is making a very strong stand and inflicting enormous casualties on the Russians. And it's not sustainable if the Russians hope to continue losing 1,000 casualties per day trying to take some of these Ukrainian strongholds.
Mm-hmm. And I think at the same time, as you mentioned, you know, if it would fall, I mean, this is a very vital area in the whole region. I mean, if we're looking at Donetsk, I mean, critical juncture to different things. But there are also other stronghold cities around there and fortresses that the Russians never been able to get at. But at the same time, if we're looking at, if I'm reminded of Avdiivka, of Bakhmut, these are also long-term battles. Is this shaping up to be one of the same? Do you think those special forces and the attention of the Ukrainians can rout the Russians, or is this going to just carry on as a war of attrition? How do you see it play out in the next few weeks?
Well, I think first, even before this battle, the Russians learned of how to aggregate a lot of their drone forces and build upon some of their successful tactics in Kursk and try to collapse the flanks, narrow the supply routes into these cities or towns, and hit all the vehicles that are coming in. So I think a lot of attention has been on the fact that Ukraine does have infantry shortages and there's not enough infantry on the front. But I think the even harder part has been that the Russians aggregate so much of their drone forces and better drone units, and they hit all the supply routes coming into these towns. And the Russians have learned their lesson from the prior years in the war. They've invested into mass, so they're producing a lot of drones. And now, by having so many drones, they're able to neutralize some of the advantages that Ukraine has had. And whether it's the pickup trucks trying to deliver supplies, or now the Ukrainians are widely deploying unmanned ground vehicles or ground robots to deliver some of the logistics, there's just such a high concentration of drones that makes it really difficult to get supplies there. Ukraine is trying to do some of these limited counterattacks, but given the what Zelensky said to be the 8-to-1 ratio of the Russian soldiers to Ukrainian, is just going to be a really colossal effort and very costly trying to take the rest. But I think what the Ukrainians are hoping for is to make sure that the attritional numbers are very favorable, and for the ground that the Russians gain, that they inflict as many casualties as possible. And if the Russians continue to try to hope to expand this even further and further, it's only going to get costlier. And I think finally we're seeing the Ukrainians taking better steps to fortify the remaining defensive lines, which should have been done years ago. But there's better and more improved defensive lines being built. And as the Russians try to take those, it's also going to continue increasing the losses that the Russians are taking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And also, as you said, this is a costly endeavor. I mean, really for both sides, but in particular for the Russians. You said 1,000 soldiers losses per day recently. Looking also at drones, I mean, this is something interesting as well, as we see a pivot, a recent strike, long-range drone strikes actually by Ukraine into Russian-occupied Crimea, hitting oil depots, refineries there. What kind of impact is that going to have? Do you think this is going to rattle Russia enough? I mean, what's the significance of those kind of strikes? It's not the first time we're seeing them, but I think on Crimea, I think that's worthwhile mentioning.
Yeah, Ukraine for throughout 2025 has focused on a concentrated drone campaign to eliminate not only Russian air defenses, but hitting Russian military installations. And so certainly there's been a very focused campaign against occupied Crimea itself. And that is not only limited to drones that Ukraine has been sending over the air, but there's been the use of drone carriers at sea that drive up close to the shore. And then they launch FPV drones from the sea drone carriers to hit targets inland. So Ukraine has a multi-vector approach to trying to hit the Russians at sea, at air against Crimea. They've been taking out numerous air defense installations across Crimea, potentially preparing for some sort of larger operation against the Russians in Crimea.
Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, looking at the silver lining here as well, I mean, there's obviously the domestic production. Ukraine is producing more weapons on their own. I think there's even some estimate there's going to be about 60 billion in production by 2026. I mean, that's significant. But I want to ask also about this recent announcement by Sweden. That's become quite an involved ally of Ukraine, I think already supplying certain Gripen fighters. There'll be more on the way. Also, archery, artillery, funding for about 400 Ukrainian long-range drones as well. So, I mean, this is good on paper. How long is this going to, let's say, take effect? How long can these deployments take? And what does it ultimately mean for then frontline support and frontline ability of Ukraine?
Yeah, I would break it up into two phases. I think I think both Trump and many Western leaders see that no matter how much they try to acquiesce or meet Putin and be fairly lenient with them, he's shown no desire for peace whatsoever, and he wants to complete capitulation of the Ukrainian government. And I think Europe is certainly realizing that this war will drag out for longer and longer, and there's a need to prepare for the long war. And now for the government in Kyiv, they're also focused on the long war, and this assistance and partnership with governments like Sweden, being able to procure some of these advanced fighter jets for Ukraine, and developing some of these production lines, and getting these weapon systems built, developed for the long term is going to be really important for Ukraine's war effort. The other side to this is ultimately Ukraine needs to be self-sufficient as much as possible, not just in the production of these weapons, but in how it uses these weapons. I think one of the key themes throughout the first few years of the war was Ukraine was being given Western weapons and then being told of how it should use or not use these weapons. But now that Ukraine has been able to build its own long-range drone fleet, nobody can really tell Kyiv how to use it, and so it's been using it to a very effective way of hitting Russian oil refineries and other military installations, and it's making it very painful, very costly for the Russians. And so Ukraine is going to continue to develop more of these weapons, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see what role Ukraine's domestic cruise missile production plays, how much they can scale, and it's only going to increase the impact of the warheads and make it more costly for the Russians to continue waging this war. And so Ukraine certainly needs to continue betting on itself, but for the long term, ensure that these effective partnerships with the West are developed so that it secures the advanced weaponry and system that it needs to fight a long war.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of different factors here, and I want to shift a little bit more closer into Europe now with Brussels. And I mean, this is something that the Europeans have been scrambling with. I mean, Belgium has announced an emergency session. There have been drone sightings there. Also, the Belgian authorities said very much that very likely it's a Russian involvement. When you look at that as well, what's your take on that? I mean, is this part of more of a psychological let's say, tactic by the Russians? Is this part of a broader hybrid effort? How do you see these recent drone sightings, not just in Belgium, but across Europe? Just briefly before we close.
Of course. I mean, I think there's a few factors to it. One is certainly psychological. The Russians are trying to show that they're comfortable escalating. They're willing to rattle the Europeans and try to force them to acquiesce to Russian demands. Second, there's an economic impact. If you're deploying these drones, shutting down airports over time, the economic impact of like shutting down airports or transit is going to continue building. And then third is Russia certainly hoping to break the political will and the resolve of the European alliance and hope that the Europeans give up in supporting Ukraine, and also just having the Europeans focus more on these problems of drone sightings and trying to divert funds from the battlefield, well, helping Ukraine's battlefield effort and investing into more domestic drone surveillance or other technologies. And of course, it takes attention away from what's going on in the battlefield and what the needs of Ukrainian defenders and ultimately what Ukraine needs to win. And so the Russians are certainly trying to hit the Europeans behind the front line in Ukraine and undermine their political and will and resolve. And all this ties back to Russia's aims on the battlefield, which is to try to prevail and conquer Ukraine and move on forward. And I think now that there's been more murmurings and discussions about using the Russian frozen assets to try to help and support Ukraine, I think the Russians will only get more desperate, try more and more of these measures. And really the solution for some of this is give Ukraine the long-range weaponry that it needs, or invest into more of Ukraine's long-range drone and missile production. Ukraine can use that to hit the Russian drone factories and
so it
just
sounds
stop
like,
the Russians
sorry to jump in there, David. It sounds like there's still many, many layers here. As you said, domestic production has to meet also support from Europe. The allies need to continue. So, and at the same time, we have to be wary of Russia along the way. Look, we'll have to close it there, unfortunately. But look, really appreciate all those insights this morning. David Kirichenko, their associate fellow, Henry Jackson study. Much appreciated. Thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but there's much more right here on TVP World, so don't go away.